Australian rules football is an unpredictable sport at the best of times. I mean, just look at the way the ball bounces sometimes. Every round of the AFL season, you can just about guarantee there's going to be at least one upset or surprising result. But sometimes the results are so surprising it leaves pretty much everyone scratching their head. This is exactly what just happened in round 13 of the current 2024 season when Melbourne took on Fremantle in Alice Springs. The D's were slight favourites going into the game, and had they won, they would have jumped into the top 4. Instead, what eventuated was a complete demolition job by the Fremantle Dockers, who ran home 92-point winners. This match really showed how unpredictable the AFL can be at times, and it's far from the first time that a complete smashing has come out of seemingly nowhere. So in this video, we're going to look back through the AFL era, 1990 to now, and go over some of the most unexpected beltings of all time. The first match we'll be looking at took place in the second final round of the 2023 home and away season, where GWS took on Essendon. At the time of this matchup, both teams were in contention for finals. However, neither team was really in that great a form, as GWS had lost their last 2 games, while Essendon had only narrowly managed to beat West Coast and North Melbourne, who were comfortably the 2 worst teams in the competition that year. Both teams absolutely needed to win this game, but only one team showed up to play in the end, and that was the Giants, who steamrolled their way to an incredible 126-point victory, which was the second biggest winning margin of any team that season. Because it was a home game for the Giants, they were slight favourites going into this matchup. However, I don't think anyone predicted this margin. Following this loss, Essendon were all but ruled out of finals, but the misery didn't end there, as they were smashed once again the next week by the eventual premiers Collingwood. Staying in 2023, next up we have the round 10 match between Hawthorn and West Coast. Now at the time, this was a battle between 17th and 18th on the ladder. Both teams had only one win to their name and were going pretty terribly. The Hawks were 18th, they'd copped a number of beatings, while West Coast, a couple weeks beforehand, had been beaten by 100 points and had a growing injury list. So the Hawks were slight favourites in this game, but no one really expected them to roll the Eagles by 116 points. It was quite a remarkable result in the end, and it really sent the Eagles down into a horrific patch of form, as they would go on to lose a few more games by triple figures throughout the season, although at the time this was quite a shocking result. For the second time this video, we have another match involving the Bombers, and once again it was for all the wrong reasons. In round 21 of 2019, the Dogs and the Bombers clashed in what was set up to be a very intriguing and fascinating match, as both teams were fighting for a top 8 spot. However, what we got instead was an absolute demolition job. After Essendon kicked the opening goal of the game, the Dogs went on an absolute rampage and kicked the next 21 goals in a row and put Essendon to the sword. At one stage, the margin was out above 120 points. A few late Bombers goals brought it back to 104 points, which is still a diabolical margin, especially for a team fighting for a final spot. Now, Essendon did actually manage to go on to make finals even after this terrible loss. However, they were belted in an elimination final by the West Coast Eagles. Adelaide were undefeated for the first 6 rounds of 2017, but that all changed when they took a trip to Hobart to take on North Melbourne. North only had 1 win for the season up until this point, but that didn't stop them from charging out the blocks in the first quarter, kicking 64 points to 0. While the Crows did manage to steady the ship a little bit after quarter time, North Melbourne still walked away with a 10-goal victory. However, it didn't really change the trajectory of either club's season too much, as North Melbourne finished bottom 4 that season, while Crows finished top of the ladder and made the grand final. The Sydney Swans and Hawthorn were powerhouses of the AFL during the 2010s, and in that decade they had many spectacular and thrilling matchups. However, their round 16 game in 2015 wasn't one of those. Coming into the game at Stadium Australia, the Swans were 3rd, with the Hawks 1 spot below them in 4th, so it was set up for a fantastic grand final rematch. However, the Hawks blew the Swans away in the first quarter, kicking 6 goals to none. A quick-fire hat-trick from Lance Franklin, which included his 700th career goal, got them back in the game. However, the Hawks dominated the second half, kicking 14 goals to Sydney's 3 and ran away to a whopping 89-point win. Both teams did go on to make the top 4 that year, which makes the margin a little bit bizarre. However, Hawthorn were a particularly dominant team in the second half of that season, and they did go on to win a 3rd consecutive premiership that year. In round 18 of the 2014 season, one of the craziest upsets ever happened when St Kilda beat Fremantle by 58 points. The Saints finished last in 2014, whereas Fremantle made the top 4, and coming into that game, the Dockers had an 8-game winning streak. In 2013, a similar thing happened when the Saints beat Fremantle in the final round of the season. However, the Dockers had rested a number of key players and didn't really try that hard to win that game. That wasn't the case this time round though. This result was sandwiched between 2 terrible losses for the Saints, as the week before they had just been beaten by 59 points against the Kangaroos, and the following week after they were beaten by 53 points against the Suns, who didn't play finals that year. Fremantle returned to their winning ways after this game as well, winning 4 of their last 5 games of the season, while the Saints lost their last 5 by an average of 50 points. Perhaps one of the most bizarre results in AFL history. Another extremely bizarre result which happened in 2014 was when the Swans beat Geelong by 110 points in round 11. The Swans were a dominant force throughout the home and away season of 2014. However, Geelong also finished top 4 that season, so it's safe to say that this was a very unexpected result. The only possible factor that I can think of which may have contributed to this result is the fact that this was Geelong's 3rd game in 12 days, whereas Sydney had just come off a bye and were completely rested up. So that's the only possible thing that I can think of which may have caused this massive blowout, because otherwise it just seems like a really strange result all on its own. Look away, Melbourne fans. Next up, we've got one of the most infamous games in AFL history, the Geelong 186-point belting of the Melbourne Demons in round 19 of 2011. Now you might be wondering why this is such an unexpected result, considering that Geelong were in the midst of one of the greatest dynasties in recent history, and Melbourne weren't really any good through 2007 to 2014. Well, it's easy to forget that before this game, Melbourne were actually in contention to play finals. There was still a possibility that they may make finals in 2011, but that was all pretty much put to bed after this game. But while they weren't terrible before this game, this result definitely did send them spiraling down the ladder, and in 2012 and 2013, they really hit rock bottom, only collecting 6 wins across both of those seasons. Going back a year earlier, and we have another game involving Geelong. This time they handed out a 101-point belting to the Western Bulldogs. Going into their round 20 matchup, both teams were contending for the top 4, and in fact both teams did make the top 4. Geelong finished 2nd, while the Bulldogs finished 4th. The Bulldogs did make a prelim, however they stood no chance to Geelong on this day, who decided to pull out one of their best performances, if not their single best performance for the season. This is another one that's just really hard to comprehend how it happened. I mean, Geelong were a very dominant team through this time, but to beat a fellow top 4 team by 101 points, and they weren't actually even the best team in that season. They didn't finish top of the ladder, nor did they win the premiership. That was, in both cases, Collingwood. So this one's just a really random result that can't really be explained. Going back a couple more years to 2008 with this one, and we have Geelong again, although this time they were on the receiving end of a surprise belting. Coming into their round 9 matchup with Collingwood, the Cats were undefeated, while the Pies were a middle-of-the-table team. The Pies would go on to finish 8th that year, while the Cats would finish top of the ladder with only 1 loss. Of course, they did go on to lose the grand final as well that year, but for the home and away season, they only lost 1 game, that being this game at the MCG, and they would go on to lose it by 86 points, which actually gave them the incredible record of having the highest average losing margin in a home and away season. In what was one of the single most dominant home and away seasons in AFL history, maybe only behind Essendon in 2000, this was an extreme outlier and quite a crazy result. For this next game, we move all the way back to 1996 when Collingwood took on North Melbourne in round 15. North Melbourne would go on to be the eventual premiers that season, and coming into this matchup, they were top of the ladder while Collingwood were bottom 4. So it was looking like it was probably going to be a pretty easy win for North Melbourne, but Collingwood put up a spirited performance in the first half, leading at halftime by a single point. Most people would have thought that North Melbourne would click into gear and run away with the game, but instead the opposite happened, and Collingwood started to burst away. At three-quarter time, they led by 20 points, and then they really ran away with the game in the last quarter. They ended up winning by 61 points in a remarkable upset victory and a pretty unexpected belting. And finally, for the last shock belting that we'll be looking at in this video, we have not one but 2 games during the 1995 season. Carlton during that year were by far the most dominant team. They won the premiership quite comfortably in the end. They won both the grand final and the prelim final by in excess of 60 points. However, they did have a slight blip in the radar during round 8 and 9, where they lost to the 12th place Sydney Swans and St Kilda, who were 14th back-to-back. They lost both these games by over 50 points. They were really quite random results because they went back to their winning ways immediately after. They beat Hawthorn by 102 points in round 10 and got their season back on track. They didn't lose a single game after those 2 losses, so it's really a mystery what happened with those games. I'm sure Carlton fans wouldn't have minded losing those 2 since it was just a blip in the radar in the end, as they powered on to one of the most dominant seasons in AFL history. So there are some of the craziest and most unexpected beltings in AFL history. I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you think there's a couple of games that I should have included that I missed out on, please be sure to leave them in the comments below. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.